is the She is the founder and principal of Fair Forest Consulting. She holds a PhD in forestry with a specialization in gender, justice, and environmental change, and a graduate certificate in community engagement from Michigan State University. She also has published several research papers about the exact topics we'll be talking about today. Next up, we have Dawn Chavez, Executive Director of our very own Asheville GreenWorks. Before she was with us, she worked for 12 years with Boston Youth Environmental Network and the Education Director of the Urban Ecology Institute. So we have two amazing women who are looking at this from different angles. And without further ado, Christine, you want to get started?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And if there's any questions as I'm presenting, then feel free to put it in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer questions if there's necessary clarifications throughout or at the end. We should have plenty of time for dialogue and questions. So specifically what I'll be focusing on today is my area of expertise and work is environmental justice in urban and community forestry, evidence and opportunities for action. And yes, I'm the founder and principal of Fair Forest Consulting. You can go to my website if you'd like to see more about what I'm doing, what I've done. So I'll just give a definition of environmental justice to ground our discussion, and then discuss why urban and community forestry is an environmental justice issue. Specifically, there's a couple aspects of environmental justice that are really important to consider when we're talking about urban and community forestry specifically. And then I'll discuss my dissertation research in Detroit, Michigan, understanding no tree requests, predominantly in communities of color and low-income communities, in response to a nonprofit street tree planting program. So these were people who said, no, don't plant the tree there between the sidewalk and the street in front of my house. And then some strategies that I use and teach in my work as a consultant based on this research, as well as other people's research on how to improve equity. We'll discuss what equity means exactly. So this is a picture on the left where in Detroit, Michigan, I was participating in, that was part of my data collection. I did qualitative and community engaged research. So I was out in the field planting trees with people, volunteers, talking with residents and staff at the nonprofit. And now I'm currently integrating equity into urban forest plans in Oakland, California, and Holyoke, Massachusetts. We just actually completed what I believe is the first ever urban forest equity plan. So it's not an urban forest master plan, it's specifically focused on equity. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's such an important issue there and how it applies to other places. But environmental justice is an important thing that we're all, I think, focused on these days, especially. And there's a big definition from the EPA that's generally accepted and quite comprehensive. They state that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So justice is an aspiration, because we currently have not achieved fair treatment or meaningful involvement adequately for all people, regardless of race and all these other characteristics. We have not gotten there. That's what justice would look like. So equity is a tool we're trying to use to get there. But this is a picture from actually North Carolina, Warren County, and this is in the 1980s when the environmental justice movement really started to become more prominent, because evidence was abounding that areas that were predominantly Black and lower income were areas where you can see here protesters are attempting to block the transfer of this toxic PCB waste to a landfill in response to the state's decision to site that hazardous landfill in a predominantly low-income Black area. So a lot of these hazardous land uses resulting from industrialization were, instead of being handled in a way that would protect everyone's health, they were cited in certain areas based on race and income so that it would affect those people more. And you can see, I mean, people laying on the street to try to block this hazardous land use is an example of unfair treatment, as well as not having meaningful involvement in that decision. And the consequences, of course, health, economic, and otherwise, are experienced by people in these communities, and it's based largely on race and income. So what happened is that redlining is a common thread here. So in areas across the United States, redlining was a practice where mortgage lenders would assess risk, and it was largely determined based on race and ethnicity. And so you can see on the right some of these signs saying the tract is exclusive and restricted. People in Detroit, this is saying we want white tenants in our white community. And so as a result of these housing practices, that's where you had the siting of hazardous waste facilities, but you also had implications for urban and community forestry. So this is a study last year showing that these racist housing practices from the 1930s, again, that were based on race and ethnicity, are now, these red line neighborhoods, even within the same cities, are hotter than other neighborhoods in their same city. And so this is a lot has to do with tree canopy coverage, and it's all tied to money. And so this is actually a map in Asheville showing redlining in Asheville. And the red areas, red is like the lowest rating. That's why it's called redlining. So this area is basically targeted for disinvestment. It's not a desirable area. And a lot of that was because more people of color were moving there. And so then you had resources, financial and otherwise, essentially leaving those areas because they were rated poorly. And you can see here, this is a website that exists. It's a really great resource I found here for Asheville. But basically, these areas have higher rates of health issues like asthma, lower economic growth, and can be vulnerable to gentrification, which means when these areas are lower in environmental quality and economic viabilities, and there's renovations or revitalization happens, but it's done in a way to try to attract wealthier people to move there and displaces lower income people and often people of color. That's what we mean by gentrification. And unfortunately, greening, planting trees in areas can, if done to serve the desires of wealthier outsiders rather than residents who live there now, that can actually exacerbate gentrification. So the reason that you have this higher rates of asthma, lower economic growth, and health issues is not only because these neighborhoods are closer to hazardous land use and industrial land use, which increases pollution, but also you had white people who had money and resources leaving these areas when they were rated as redlining, and investing their money mostly in the suburbs or other neighborhoods outside of those areas. And so the tree canopy in those neighborhoods that were redlined and mostly people of color declined right at the time, really, when that tree canopy could have helped, at least to some degree, mitigate the pollution and negative health effects. But instead, the tree canopy declined. This is Detroit, Michigan. You see in the same street, 1971 to 1984. Detroit was also the epicenter for Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer. But as money fled these neighborhoods and were reinvested in primarily white areas, the tree canopy was not maintained properly. So this is a really prominent article talking about trees growing on money and money being tied often to race. This is just from that article showing the dark purple areas. This is Baltimore on the left, are predominantly more Black residents. And on the right, the darker green areas are higher tree canopy. So you can see the light purple where you have less Black residents, you have more tree canopy. And same thing here, Sacramento, California, more Black residents, less tree canopy. And this has just been found across the United States, especially since the 2000s. So this is a really big problem, really in all communities across the US, and it is based on race as well as income. So what do we mean by environmental justice? We saw in relation, just in general, it's fair treatment and meaningful involvement in environmental policies and behaviors. What does that mean in relation to urban and community forestry? Well, so what we mean by fair treatment is distributional justice. Everyone has equal access, fair treatment. They're all treated fairly. There's equal access to healthy and safe parks and green spaces. That's what it would mean to have distributional justice. Well, those maps you just saw obviously show that we are not at all near distributional justice. And a lot of that has to do with, again, disinvestment from these particular areas where people of color lived. There's also an aspect that talked about meaningful involvement. So in order to, I'm going to show this in a second, but in order to actually get to distributional justice, where everyone has the equal access to the canopies and the benefits of trees, you need to have procedural justice, which means fair, meaningful involvement in the processes we use to actually improve tree canopies. So it means we need to be including people in those neighborhoods that we're trying to serve that have been disenfranchised and oppressed and treated poorly for generations. It's about, and that was done through completely excluding them from decision-making processes. So now, in order to achieve environmental justice, it's really important that we include residents in setting our vision. Why are we planting trees? What are our goals? As well as how are we going to achieve those goals? Where are we going to plant trees? Where should we prioritize that? What species should we plant? What are the costs and benefits of different assemblages of tree species? Who will take care of the trees, how and when? These are really important discussions to be had between urban and community forestry professionals, nonprofits, government agencies, and the residents in the neighborhoods they're hoping to serve. And again, this leads to distributional justice. And you're going to see why in the research I did in Detroit, why there's this link, why we can't just go into low canopy communities and just plant trees without actually working with people in meaningful ways. Because it seems like, the direct path, okay, we have less trees here, we need to plant more trees here, but it's just not that simple. So in Detroit, Michigan, from 2011 to 2014, I was working with a nonprofit. They were collecting data during that time, and they found that 25% of residents who were eligible for a free street tree from the nonprofit were submitting no tree requests and declining that offer. And my job was to figure out why and what can we do to address this issue, because these are neighborhoods, again, that have less well-maintained, less healthy, and less abundant tree canopy and could potentially benefit from that. So this is a map in Detroit of where the nonprofit was planting trees sort of throughout the city. And their mission was to inspire sustainable growth of a healthy urban community through trees, green spaces, healthy living, education, training, and job opportunities. So this is their mission, but unfortunately their actions weren't really helping to achieve that. They weren't necessarily, the trees were supposed to be a mechanism to inspire healthy growth of the community, but the focus was really just on the trees and not so much the community. And that led to a lot of problems. So the goal again was, we need to plant lots of trees in these areas that have less trees. And so these door hangers talking about the benefits of trees and how, asking people to help water the trees were essentially put on people's doors 2 weeks before a tree planting. And the staff said, we tend to do this during a time of day we know people will not be home because of the amount of dialogue or time it takes to actively engage in those conversations. So again, and this is like the focus, and what this was part of the problem. And this is you can see these are pictures in Detroit. You see an enormous limb has fallen on the left here. You see a stump that hasn't been removed. And then a newer tree on the right hasn't been very well maintained. And this is because the maintenance side wasn't being addressed. And this, when I actually interviewed residents and asked them about, what do you think are the benefits of trees? Do you, because that's the main barrier that the nonprofit thought. People just don't understand how important trees are. And we need to educate them and then they'll be on board. But that wasn't the problem that I found. So this is a woman who said no to a tree. And she said, I love trees, actually. Makes things beautiful. It makes shade. I love trees. There's no problem with trees. The problem with trees is they have to be maintained. And in our neighborhood, they're not being maintained. And as I showed you, there's abundant evidence to back up what she's saying, that at the time I did this study, there were 20,000 dead standing trees in Detroit, and the city had the budget to address 2,000 a year. And I had residents telling me, I'm afraid to sleep in my house at night during a storm because a tree came down on my neighbor's house, and it's incredibly unsafe and scary. Even when I was walking through neighborhoods, I could hear branches creaking over my head, and I was like, I don't think I want to stand here. And so there was a lot of really negative experiences people had with maintenance and the lack of a sustainable vision that didn't incorporate their viewpoints. And that wasn't being addressed. It was just about getting trees in the ground, and then we'll deal with the rest of it later. But that's, residents were like, no, this is going to end up becoming more of a problem if we don't develop an appropriate maintenance plan, which the city has shown us for decades is not happening. So unless that's being addressed, this doesn't seem like it's going to end in a good benefit for us. And I was asking the nonprofit, so you can see this is in front of people's houses. Their houses are in poor shape here, and then this tree is planted. And so you're dealing with a lot of interrelated issues of maintenance and challenges with community upkeep. So I asked the nonprofit, why are you having such a struggle with maintenance? They said, well, it's really sexy to plant trees and it's fundable to plant trees, but it's not sexy to maintain or monitor those trees. So they were struggling to get the support from funders. But the residents were very clear, even though it's the city property, we're going to end up having to care for it, raking leaves, and God knows whatever else we might have to do. You know, you have to also think about, a lot of people mentioning the infrastructure, the pipes underground are not being very well maintained or kept up, so they often crack, and then roots can seek out water, right? So this was a challenge, and it was not being addressed. And residents wanted to know, this is in high no tree request and average no tree request. So people in neighborhoods where 25% was the average around there said no, and then more, potentially a third or more people said no. And I asked them, what do you want to know? And they actually did want to know how to care for the tree, who to contact if something is wrong, who will care for the tree and how, what's my responsibility, like how can we do this together, right? And recognizing that these are lower income areas oftentimes with financial constraints. So what this is getting at is, what I'm kind of pointing out here is, these are equity considerations. People want support in order to accept trees. And that's exactly what equity is about. So this is a really great diagram focusing inequalities on the top left. Obviously, we know there are areas with less tree canopy and less benefits from tree canopy. On the right here, the trees and the benefits, like the apples here, are more in the whiter, wealthier areas. Equality would mean we're evenly distributing tools and assistance for the tree canopy across all neighborhoods. So everyone gets the same size ladder. Everyone gets the same amount of financial assistance or technical assistance. Everyone gets the same thing. Well, this side already has more benefits, so they don't need as much assistance to improve the tree canopy, right? This, on the right side, there needs to be more specific, tailored, customized tools to help us fix the situation. So equity is custom tools that identify and address the inequality. So this larger ladder, that can mean financial support. Residents need more financial support to do tree maintenance, or technical guidance and training. Residents saying, I don't even know how to care for this tree. Or I need help with the watering, or equipment, or physical assistance. Sometimes people needed physical help, or outreach assistance. So that's what was needed. And ultimately, by providing these custom tools, the goal is that we will fix the system so that we won't have to keep giving more tools to certain areas than others, because by doing the equity, we will help communities get to that even distribution of the tree canopy and the benefits, and we won't have to do equity anymore. That's the ultimate goal, but we're pretty far away from that right now. But this is like an ideological, this can be a really difficult conversation in the US that's very polarized about what does equality mean? And it's important to understand the historical context so that that we can recognize that why equity is so important, why certain areas need and deserve more resources right now than others when it comes to the tree canopy. But this becomes political very quickly. So all of this comes to mean that in order to have a sustainable urban forest in these low canopy areas that continue to produce the same benefits at the same level over time, you need to not only have the healthy tree that you plant, but you also need to have a supportive community. And my research showed an adequate maintenance regime that affects whether you have a supportive community. Because obviously you need people to accept the trees. But in order to accept the trees, they're saying we need more help and we need much more robust, collaborative, supportive maintenance program here. And we can't just be expected to not be involved in selecting these trees, and then all of a sudden we have to maintain them and we don't know how. It's like a recipe for disaster, essentially. So this is really important, to stop and listen to people and whenever people tell you what the problem is from their perspective, they're also telling you the solution. So they're telling you the problem is we don't have resources for maintenance. We don't have dialogue for that. Our trees aren't being cared for. That's the solution then, right? Is we need to be providing these resources and helping people. And so these community perspectives can really, by understanding them, can inform dialogue and policies. Again, the goal is not to try to change people in those neighborhoods, what they, it's about understanding and meeting them where they are. And so it's providing that detailed information. People saying, well, I would have been more open to accepting a tree if I had gotten more information about the tree's appearance over time, and what are the maintenance needs, and what are the resources available. And so if they had had that information, a lot of people said they would have been more open to accepting a tree, but they weren't given that. So they just said no. Again, sharing power and broadening the values. So offering people choices. Obviously, you can't plant like a palm tree in Detroit, but there's a lot of different options for trees we can plant, and we can share power with people and come up with a plan together and share information together. And then following up with residents was really important. They just were like, the tree's planted and no one came back to help really, or I just didn't feel like there was enough support. So we need to be not just measuring how many trees we're planting, we need to be measuring how many residents actually want to become involved, because the program is desirable. Their neighbor is having a great experience because they're involved, and then you're attracting more people. How many people are involved in stewardship because they have the support, and then the trees survive more, are more likely to survive. So this is why it's so important to talk to people and get these solutions. And I want to just point out this is an older diagram, but it's characteristics of social forestry. And social forestry is in the middle. It means community-driven partnerships, which it could be initiated by the professional, like by an organization like the Greening of Detroit, or it can be initiated by communities. But the key is that there's shared decision-making. On the right here, you see many community tree planting programs are sort of what we call sharecropping programs, where they just use community labor, but it's the professional initiates and controls the process. And this is what was happening in Detroit. And this is from the 90s, this diagram. So this trend has been going on for a while. And this is sometimes, unfortunately, where some programs can get stuck. And there's funding issues around that. Oh, we don't have funding for community engagement. So it is more difficult, but I just wanted to point this out. The goal is not to get over to the left, which is green guerrillas, which is basically where the community initiates and the professional is uninvolved. And that's not desirable either, because the professional does bring really important, helpful knowledge about trees and tree growth and tree maintenance that residents need and want to make the program successful and sustainable. But it's about shared decision making. So just to get into a few strategies based on this, I'm just kind of looking at time. So in Holyoke, Massachusetts, I was just mentioning, we just finished this urban forest equity plan. The community engagement for the planning process itself was not as robust as I would like, because it was in the middle of COVID. And so we had to do a lot of like Zoom, or there weren't a lot of options. People were kind of trying to deal with a lot of things at once, and there weren't a lot of robust options for community engagement. So that's part of the recommendations we make in the plan, is how to improve upon that moving forward. But what happened was, before this plan happened, there was a state designed program. So the State Department of Conservation on the right, the solid lines show a successful stewardship relationship, which means the trees survived. The dotted line is an unsuccessful stewardship relationship, so the trees did not survive, or were much less likely. So you see there was an unsuccessful stewardship relationship from the state to the local program recipients, the public housing, public schools, businesses, and tenants down here. What happened was the Department of Conservation relied on local program recipients to purchase their own slow release watering bags or buckets, and for them to seek help if the trees under their local stewardship did not fare well. Well, if you're going into communities that have reasonable and longstanding distrust of government, expecting them to reach out to you is a fool's game. That's not going to happen probably. And it doesn't happen. The evidence shows a lot of the time. So in contrast, the trees that were stewarded by the state benefited from these pre-purchased watering bags, which, by the way, drastically reduces the time needed for watering which would be really helpful in communities where people work a lot of jobs and have limited time. These trees that were stewarded by the state foresters were 5 times more likely to survive. So now what happens is that means that these communities that didn't have those benefits now have dead trees. So now they're actually worse off than they were before. So this is why it is so important to think about equity and to actually talk to people about what it is that they need. And this is why people in Detroit they weren't dumb for turning down trees. They were like, hey, we see where this is going. We need to take a step back here and have a much better plan in place instead of this top down, whatever, quick as possible, getting trees in the ground. It's just not sustainable. So what I suggest to a lot of communities is first to learn about the diversity of the population in your area. So in Holyoke, this is Policy Map. This is one tool that's free you can use. You can look at demographics, income and spending, housing, renters, owners, all in your area, census block and everything. And this is important because in Holyoke, we targeted 4 specific neighborhoods that were downtown. They were closest to industrial uses, high amount of like 90% or more Hispanic population. A lot of people had moved there from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And these are lower income areas, high percentage of renters, and the lowest tree canopy and the most impervious surface. So these are obviously areas that we want to be focusing on equity tools. But then you want to go a step further and identify the local groups and opportunities to collaborate. These could be community development corporations, CDCs, church leaders, community groups, neighborhood associations, school system administrators, youth organizations. We reached out to all of these to try to garner involvement. In Detroit, I got lucky because they actually have a map of community groups. So that was super helpful. But the next step is to cultivate relationships and build trust. It's not okay to just go to these groups and say, we already know what we want you to do in this collaborative relationship. We want you to get us residents to help plant trees and help maintain those trees. It's not about that. It's about, this is actually a resident I interviewed in Detroit. It's about promoting trust and actually building sustainable relationships so that you can sustain the tree canopy. So what promotes trust? Well, and this probably makes sense to you because you can think about in your own head, who do you trust the most in your life? This usually is there's a long-term situation, so you can see someone's behavior over time, whether you can trust them. There's an opportunity to learn about others' reputations. Also really important, there's a possibility of communication between all the relevant parties. So there's mutual dialogue and mutual learning happening, which unfortunately in this case in Detroit and in other places, there's not enough time often dedicated to that process. And what that means is active listening skills. So instead of coming to people and saying, don't you know how great trees are? We need to promote tree planting. It's more about, hey, what do you think about trees? What do you think are the benefits? Why? What are your concerns? So asking open-ended questions, requesting clarification, really being attentive, making sure you're understanding people properly. So when they say something like, I'm not getting a tree because this tree is not being taken care of, I would say, okay, so you're concerned about taking care of another tree. Why is that? Is it financial? Is there other things to be considered? You need to also be very attuned to people's feelings and empathize with them about frustration, because this process of being marginalized, disenfranchised, disempowered is extremely upsetting generationally over time. And if someone comes at you and they don't care about that experience or how that made you feel, they're probably not going to feel that they can trust you and talk to you and that you actually care about them. So this is just really, these are some skills that I teach different groups about community engagement because it's really important. Some suggestions I always give groups is to ask residents a couple main questions. One would be, what is special about your community? What do you like about living here? What's great about it here? And also, what are the main challenges that you're facing in this community? And it could be your neighborhood or the city. What's great about this is you can collect data and then you can facilitate dialogue among people, and you can share that you have listened to people and use that as a jumping off board for collaboration. So this is something like in Detroit, what I would do is I would listen for what people would say. And they would say, okay, what's special about my community is that our community is really organized. So that's community cohesion. We have, let's say, street lights, more street lights and essential services being put in, that's city services. And we don't have that many vacant properties, so that's good. Some of the challenges might be we don't have that many economic opportunities. We don't have prompt or adequate tree care. We don't really have a lot of trees. So what this helps us to do is to figure out the context we're working in and how can a community forestry program genuinely help address the challenges faced. So if people are saying we need more economic opportunities, how can an urban community forestry program help provide that? The special attributes tell you what assets you're working with that could help make a community program successful. So in Detroit, there were a lot of neighborhood-based groups that had arisen because, again, like a lack of city services, so residents came together to try to create their own ways of managing things. But so they're already organized. And so that's great, and that's an asset. And so you can actually work with that and support those groups that already exist rather than having maybe to start from square one and try to figure out ways to organize the community. This is also really important, implementing meaningful community engagement programs. This is something we recommended in Holyoke. So this is, I really like this from Provo Power in Utah on the right. It's a postcard that shows this is the height a tree could grow to. This is the species. This is the growth rate. It's a slow growing tree. Here's some information that people want to know. It's well adapted to our climate. What does it look like? The leaves turn bright red in the fall. The advantages, it's drought tolerant, withstands cold. Disadvantages, it doesn't tolerate extremely wet soils. This is the stuff people wanted to know to help make collaborative decisions with the foresters that would work for everybody. So these are the kinds of meaningful engagement I'm talking about, not just how are we getting these door hangers telling people trees are great, but rather how are we providing the information people want and need to be part of the process so we can make these decisions together. Some strategies that I was saying that can kind of meet needs and address challenges, like we need jobs. There's this great report called Jobs and Equity in the Urban Forest. And so these are like strategies to avoid abandoning communities after planting, which is what was happening in Detroit. So for example, you could look at a community benefits agreement, which is piloted in Portland, Oregon. It was signed by a large group of more than 40 community organizations, labor unions, and businesses. Contains legal and binding language on hiring, contracting, workforce training, and community oversight. So this really helps to make sure that the community's needs are being met and the support is provided to make this useful for everybody. Also, the whole issue of gentrification, just so you know, when I was looking at the Asheville website, the GIS data, Asheville, I did not know this, is number 2 in the speed of gentrification across the United States. It's pretty severe. So what needs to happen is thinking more about not only how can we green these areas, but how can we couple this with affordable housing policies so that people are not displaced when their area becomes greener. Affordable housing means that the household does not pay more than 30% of their income on housing. Community land trusts are one option, which basically they are nonprofits, community-based organizations that are designed to ensure community control and ownership of land and development, which basically means they grant community members the opportunity to be homeowners while also protecting the land from housing, from market-driven development and displacement associated with gentrification. And the way this connects with greening is that these community land trusts can improve sense of belonging through landscaping and development of community gardens or urban and community forestry projects. And this is a really great website. This is in Barcelona. Isabel Anguilowski is an amazing scholar in this area of environmental justice and urban and community forestry. And this is her research group out of Barcelona. I highly recommend checking out their entire report. It's really comprehensive. The last thing I always recommend is monitoring your plan and following up. So beyond just number of trees planted, how satisfied are residents with the actual process and outcomes? How many additional residents want to become involved? That will tell you if your program is actually desirable. And also involvement in stewardship over time tells you if you're meeting the needs that people have for support so that they can be involved in stewardship. And it's really helpful if you can collect baseline data before you implement a new program so you can evaluate before and after. If you can't, it's okay, but it's best if you can do that. So I'm doing a lot of training around these topics right now with actually Asheville GreenWorks and some other groups with the Alliance for Community Trees, which is an Arbor Day Foundation program. That's going on all summer. That's just something I'm doing, just so you're aware of that. It's an interactive web-based training in environmental justice for urban forestry groups. And I think I talked for long enough. So I hope that was useful. And these are just some of this is my contact information and some of what I do with my consulting business, but I would be happy to take any questions or comments at this point.
We don't have any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Well, this is Kelly Carlson. I live here in Asheville. I just want to say it's a great presentation. I learned so much, not just from a forestry perspective, but just how to engage in a community, right? How important it is to just be good listeners and pay attention, right, to what communities need. So it's such a great presentation. I'm hoping that I can kind of go back and grab some of those links that I saw in the presentation. I wasn't able to grab them and write them down fast enough. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, let me, I can go through, were there ones in particular that I can put them in the chat box?
Right, there was the one about the report from the Barcelona group. I didn't grab that one.
I'm going to put that here. You can get, yeah, the great resources.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I think there was this, this publication about equity and jobs in the urban forest.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.
That was from 2017, so pretty new, and they have a lot of great kind of pilot programs for ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then I think there was maybe just, the Asheville site. I don't know if anyone knew about this. The race where they mapped the redlining and all of this. It's really quite a lot of helpful information there that I found.
I'll be touching on that a lot in my presentation. So
great.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for your comment, Kelly.
There was another question about land banks and how these were developed.
Oh, is there a question in the chat about it?
Mm-hmm.
Land banks, yes. So let me go back to this community land trusts. That is a great question. So yeah, this is from Detroit. Oh wait, I have to share my screen. Hello. So yeah, this is just on the right. You can see they have, this is an info session. This was in 2018. And so they essentially, you can see it's a collaboration between CDAD is Community Development Associations of Detroit. So it's like it's a one-stop hub for any community-based organizations to gain access to what's going on in the city, what can they participate in. Usually community land trusts are like, again, nonprofit community-based organizations, but some of this land has to be discussed. Like usually the city will be part of this process where the land is available, and they will facilitate dialogue with community-based organizations to help them through the process of how they could actually create a land trust themselves. So usually, like you see here, staff attorney. So this is usually what happens is you have the city staff attorney or someone who is for an organization that can train the local community-based organizations in the legal process of setting up a community land trust. And so you need someone who knows that legal process to come in and basically facilitate discussion. And there also has to be land that's available that would otherwise go to market-driven development. And usually the city can be helpful in this because they will point out to residents, hey, there's this huge block of vacant properties that would be an ideal location for a community land trust. So residents may not necessarily come up with that on their own. So it's pretty helpful when you have an outside organization or city government that can say this would be an ideal land for this, and then provide training for the community-based organizations and help them access grants if they need to actually set this nonprofit up so they have the financial ability to set up this community land trust. So it's definitely a collaborative process. But the goal is ultimately for the community-based organizations to run it themselves, but they need a lot of help to get there usually. Hopefully that helped. There is more information on this particular policy in that Barcelona link that I sent. There's a report that they have on their website. So yes, I think somebody else maybe had something. Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad. That was a nice comment. Yeah, Dawn shared the community land trust in Asheville. Maybe Dawn can talk about that in her presentation as well. That's amazing. I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, a lot of these are really important strategies that are becoming more and more common and are really great to learn about in other locations, so you can try to not have to reinvent the wheel. Yeah, any other questions or comments?
Great. Well, if no one has any questions for now, or if you think of some questions, we can save them for later. Dr. Carmichael will still be on for Dawn's presentation. So if you have any questions.
There's one more question.
Okay, great.
Someone just put in the chat. Do you think the strategies look different at all, or for planting on private property? Ooh, yeah. There's definitely a different perspective. Like, there's been studies showing that, like in New York, residents did not feel it was their responsibility to care for street trees. And so it was more difficult to get a lot of eager residents who were saying, yeah, I want to, and I feel like I'm responsible for this tree. That's a street tree. It was more like, no, that's the city's responsibility. And so I think people in, with the private property issue, it's more of like an understanding that this is my property, I have to deal with it. But I do think the equity strategies can be similar for both, which means if people need help with, tools or equipment to water or maintain the tree, or they need an arborist to come out and help them, like, take a look at their tree if something's wrong. And I think that those tools should be available. Those equity strategies should be applied and available to people, regardless of whether it's a street tree or a private property tree, because the need is still the same for that assistance. And if we're really going to think about urban forestry as this collective good, we have to understand that those trees on private property are community assets, or can be, or they can be community liabilities as well. It's not, even though it's someone's private property, most trees, studies show, in urban areas are on private property. So if we really want to make sure that the urban forest is sustainable and that people are not being overly burdened by tree care and they get the support they need, I think we need to be applying these same strategies and making them available to people for private property and not just street trees. So that's what I would say for that. All right, I think that was, you're welcome. I think that was the questions for now, but yeah, feel free if you want to email me or put something in the chat box, and I'll stay on for the rest of the presentation today. I'm really excited to hear from Dawn about what's going on in Asheville, but I really appreciate you all listening and being part of this.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Carmichael. So we could take a quick 10-minute break, and then we will hear from Dawn. So if everyone wants to reconvene at 12:55, just take a quick bathroom or water break, and we will see you in 10 minutes. Screen sharing. Thank you for that. Will you be screen sharing? Okay, great. We can get that set up.
Well, first I just want to say hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this important discussion. Really enjoyed Dr. Carmichael's presentation. Every time I hear her present, I learn something new and different, and it's a real privilege to have you with us today. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to share my screen. I have a presentation. Okay, and if you have any questions while I'm presenting, please pop in the chat. But I'm going to talk about redlining, urban renewal, and environmental justice in Asheville as it relates to urban and community forestry. I think it's very important to understand the history and current situation of the community in Asheville when we're, or any community, when we're talking about the environment. It's important to understand the social context in which we're operating. When we talk about urban and community forestry, what makes it very unique from forestry is that there's the community aspect to it, and there's people involved. When you go to manage a forest, you'll be looking at the natural history, the conditions, the soil, the growing season, all of these different things that make up the situation for the forest. But in an urban environment, it's much more than just the trees. There's people and development that we have to consider. And then there's the social context. So redlining and urban renewal play a huge role in the history and current context of Asheville. I think it's worth spending a little time learning about that if you don't already know, or reviewing if you do, and seeing it in maybe a different context. Yeah. 1922, John Nolan put together the Asheville City Plan. And in that plan, he says the colored population of Asheville is about 33%. Nowadays, it's about 12%. So there's been a lot of flight of the African-American community from Asheville. And it is in most respects a distinct advantage to the Negroes to be separated from the white population, provided the areas in which they live are suitable in location and character. So calling for segregation and keeping it that way, and saying it's actually to people's advantage to keep it that way. In the 1930s, redlining was carried out across the country by banks so that they could determine where the best places were to make investments of loans for homeowners for mortgages. And the areas that were least desirable were outlined in red. This is the map of Asheville and its redlined areas you can see on the map. And this will come up over and over again throughout history. So for 90 years now, redlining has impacted the communities in Asheville and the national communities. So the folks who, well, how areas were redlined were looking at the population composition. So saying if there was, I'm trying to call it colored population, also, the economic situation, and areas that had a growing population of African Americans were seen as less desirable than other areas. And so loans weren't made for residents in that area. So home ownership was increasingly difficult for African Americans. We have, as Dr. Carmichael pointed out, lots of mapping resources that have just come about recently in Asheville and in other places that have Asheville as part of their data bank. And I will be sharing this presentation with you so you can have these hot links available to you. And I'll be showing you some screenshots of each one. So there's the Mapping Racial Equity in Asheville map on the City of Asheville's page, and that's the one that Dr. Carmichael pointed to earlier. There's also, if you go to this bit.ly Red Hot Cities link, you'll see redlining and exposure to urban heat islands, which lines up pretty well with the, the areas that are heat islands line up with redlined areas, and also American Forest's tree equity score. It's almost an exact overlay with tree equity in these areas as well. Then the City of Asheville also put out a climate justice map, and again, these kind of all look very similar when you take a look at them. So this is the one we saw before about redlining in Asheville. See the areas that are outlined in red. And then on this particular site that has the story map about racial equity in Asheville, you'll see displacement of African-American communities as well over time. So it's a very interesting site and map to delve into when you have some time. This is from the Red Hot Cities mapping, and there I put together just a series of screenshots so you can see. So here, this map on the bottom of the map shows you Biltmore Forest. So that area that's A is Biltmore Forest, which received an A grade in terms of redlining areas, which is the best and highest one you could get. And you can see at the top, the temperature overall is 3.6 degrees cooler than the citywide average. There's only 3.9 of the area, percent of the area is impervious surface. The tree cover is almost 82% of land cover, and the minority population is only 3.6%. So compare that to, oh no, this is another area. In North Asheville, you can see that there's also a cooler temperature than the citywide average, not so much impervious surface. Over half of the land cover is trees and a smaller minority population. And then this one is kind of central, south side, Asheville, where the temperature is actually almost 3 degrees hotter than the citywide average. 36.3% of the surfaces are impervious, and tree cover is very small compared to the other two ones I just showed you. Only 28.1% of land cover and 56% of the population are minority. You can see a stark difference just within our same small city between the areas of the haves and have-nots. There's also the American Forests just published tree equity scores for a number of cities across the US. And then they have a deeper analysis called the tree equity score analysis that the city can do. And I'm looking into partnering with them to have an analysis done for Asheville. It's about $25,000 to engage in that. So we'll see if we can raise those funds. But the tree equity score for each city is very telling. I think some of you may have seen this already and looked into it for Asheville, but you can put in, when you go to their website, you can put in your municipality. It's not for everywhere, but Asheville's on the list that they've looked at. And so you can see our tree equity score is 49%, or 49, sorry, not percent, but you want to have, you can set as a community what you want your tree equity score to be overall, and you can also look at places and neighborhoods within the city for what the different tree equity scores are. These take into account things as you can see on the left, the score indicators, the priority index with people of color, unemployment rates, children, seniors, health, temperature, and number of people in poverty. Canopy cover goal would be 48%. Our current canopy in this overall is 12%. So got a ways to go. So this is just information. It's data to take in and add to the mix of all the other data that we have. So it doesn't give us anything hard and fast, but can help inform us in our policies going forward. And then the City of Asheville's Climate Justice Index, the Climate Justice Map, it looks at a variety of different things. There's also landslide possibility, wildfire vulnerability, and other things. So, but this particular aspect, if you can look at it, looks at the heat vulnerability index and looks at land surface temperature, tree cover, age, and poverty level. If we look at Southside, and this is in the Lee Walker Heights area, you can see that the overall heat vulnerability index is 1.73. And as you read, it explains below, the closer you are to 3 for that value, the more vulnerable it is. Closer the land surface temperature is, that value to 1, the more, the higher the maximum temperatures are, and so on. So these are, I don't think these are surprising for anyone, at least they weren't for me, these results. When we look at Asheville and the neighborhoods and who's most vulnerable and who has the least amount of trees and the highest temperatures. But it does put some data-based evidence behind these kind of observations that we make. So in 1968, there was the urban renewal across the country, began as part of the New Deal. I think the intentions were probably good, but the implementation, not so much. There were basically urban renewal, some people call it urban removal, because a lot of African American communities, poor communities, were displaced, uprooted to make way for things like highways and development. And folks, in conjunction with not being able to get homeownership loans, found themselves with no homes to move to, perhaps move to public housing with the idea that they might be able to move back once the renewal projects were complete, but they never were. And this was a huge upheaval and loss of generational wealth for folks. Not to mention the effects on the environment that folks had been living in. So, putting in highways, cutting into hillsides, removing trees, all of that as well as displacing people. I'm going to show you a video in a second. Priscilla and Ndaye, the longtime resident of the Southside neighborhood, and grew up there. Her family home and the homes of all her neighborhoods were demolished during urban renewal, and they were moved out. She's showing a map of the neighborhood and standing where her house had been. There's a great article in the Asheville Blade about urban renewal that you can take a look at, and redlining. So I can share that link with you too after this session. So I'm going to share this brief a segment of this video. There was an episode of Nightline from a few weeks ago, and it's about reparations, but it does talk about urban renewal.
About living in the mountains.
It's a sense of serenity. Asheville's like a postcard. What doesn't come to mind when people think of Asheville?
Black folk, you don't think of African Americans being in Asheville.
I don't think people know of the rich Black history here.
They don't know because pretty much the history has been erased. Urban Renewal forced my family along with others to move out.
It was urban removal, the removal of Black people from their land.
Reparation is owed. My family has been here now 6 generations. This box has Asheville's Black history, mainly the history of my community, Southside. A whole community filed away in this box. Rich history filed away. Closed until I decide to open it and talk about it. I grew up in the 60s. At the time I was growing up, larger Asheville was segregated. We had everything we needed from the cradle to the grave. Black-owned homes, Black-owned businesses. It gave me a sense of pride. So at 477 Suffrage Broad, I lived in the apartment with 9 other people. Just where that pole is where I lived. So you had all of the homes that were up and down this street. And as you can see, it's empty. Urban Renewal was implemented, and so that forced us to have to move out. We relocated to public housing.
People were told this was all temporary, and we're looking at 4, 5, 6 generations of people having lived in it.
This didn't come out of nowhere. This came out of explicit policy that was designed to confine the descendants of those who had been enslaved.
We must make sure that every family in America lives in a home of dignity.
The intent was meant to improve the living conditions of African Americans. The actual outcome of an urban renewal, that was another story. And with the city, with the county, with the state, with the federal government not keeping its word to rebuild the neighborhoods.
What's here? What's here? Just the grass.
Wherever urban renewal took place, we saw the decline of living standards for African Americans, higher unemployment, poorer health, and academic achievement.
My grandparents' house, Libby and Jesse Smith, at 13 Velvet Street, would have been in this area. Behind us is the Public Works building. Prior to being the Public Works building, it was the backyard that we played in. So in 1984, this is the paperwork where my grandparents granted our land to the city. When I say granted, it's because on this document it says grantor, but I don't think that my grandparents had a choice. That's the whole point of eminent domain. It wasn't just a loss of their homes, it was a loss of what could have been generations of wealth for our family.
Since World War II, the primary source of wealth for middle-class America is the ownership of a home. Well, if your home is destroyed, you've lost a primary pillar for middle class standing.
It is enraging, and I almost get a little bit of fuel from it as well, because I do believe that the day of reckoning is coming.
So that there's more to that. That focuses more on the reparations aspect of things. So I encourage you to take a look at that, the rest of that, the whole episode, when you have time. It's incredibly powerful hearing from folks in the community and learning about how, you know, these kind of big societal ideas like urban renewal like impacted real people. And this is not like that long ago. This is within our lifetimes and still having impact today. When we talk about gathering community input, speaking to people, it has to go beyond just a survey. It has to go deeper into these conversations with people. If you've never spoken to a resident in a community where you think trees should be planted, then you shouldn't be planting trees. We really have to start there. There's been so much harm done and trust destroyed. That's where we need to begin, is with rebuilding trust and relationships with people before we think about what improvements we as outsiders to the community want to see. I have more to share. Reopen my PowerPoint. Sorry, that just every time I watch that, it really hits. Yeah, and I've met Libby. Spoken to her, and I never knew that part of her history. That public works building is now where her family home was. So going back to maps for a minute, a couple of years ago, in 2018, 19, I think it was 18, the city of Asheville conducted a urban tree canopy study, and then a group from NASA called NASA Develop carried out a research project on the changes in land surface temperature related to the change in tree canopy cover over a 35-year period. And this is just briefly the median land surface temperature in the 1980s. You see the blue areas are the cooler areas and the reddish orange areas are the warmer areas. This is in the summertime. And then in the around 2018, the land surface temperature, the median land surface temperature in the summer went up dramatically across the area, but even more severely in areas where there's less tree cover and more impervious surface. And then they took a look at this in relation to socioeconomic factors, and you can see land surface temperatures, like an overlay with the tree cover, and then socioeconomic factors, the social vulnerability, highest social vulnerability, most people living in poverty, where there's folks who are older, and the highest minority population contribute to the social vulnerability, and those are the darkest areas. And then if you put them all together, you get your overall heat vulnerability. And you can see these are the areas that were redlined and were subjected to urban renewal and are now these areas that have impervious surface and low tree cover and high minority population. So what do we do about this? With this information, and I think one of the bigger questions is who are the we that are doing something, and so it's not up to GreenWorks to sit around our conference room table, with our staff and board to come up with decisions. It's not up to the City of Asheville's Urban Forestry Commission to come up with the solutions to these issues. It's really up to a partnership, up to all of us with the community that's being affected to come up with a collaborative solution that makes the most sense for the people who've been most affected by this. Looking at the tree canopy cover in Asheville from that 2018 study, Asheville GreenWorks set a goal to bring our overall city canopy up to 50% by the year 2040. And in order to do that, we would need to plant 50,000 trees. So that's kind of this ambitious goal that's hanging out there in theory for, in order to restore the urban tree canopy to 50%. But we really have to dig deeper into what the tree canopy is now in different areas and what are the neighborhoods that are most affected. And if this is the right solution for them in order to address the hazards and conditions that are most important to them. So it might not be by planting trees. So we have to take that into account, and it might be difficult to kind of swallow our pride and think, well, we know what's best. We know that planting trees will help cool your environment and have a number of other benefits, but if the community doesn't want them, it's not up to us to force that on them or to convince them that that's the right thing. So anyway, some areas are very low tree canopy right now, and in order to get up to 50%, would take a lot more concentrated tree plantings there. So what are we doing in Asheville? So one of the things that we've done at Asheville GreenWorks is to hire through Project Conserve AmeriCorps community forestry coordinator. Samantha Truman has been our community forestry coordinator for the past year, and we have Gabby Fitz, who is now out in California but has joined us on this session today. Hi, Gabby. Was our community forestry coordinator for 2 years, and just having that position, being able to engage the community in hands-on community forestry work has been tremendous, and really being the eyes and ears on the ground to help our organization make sure that we are addressing some of these concerns. We also started a tree keeper program a couple of years ago, and to date have, I think, trained more than 40 tree keepers who are out in the community keeping an eye on things, and also are going to be helping us evaluate different neighborhoods for their appropriateness and readiness for tree planting programs and working with communities. We do targeted tree plantings with communities. We work closely with the Housing Authority to plant trees in partnership with public housing developments. And we've done a number of those. Folks, a few years ago, folks in Hillcrest, for example, wanted to plant fruit trees rather than just shade trees. And so we helped them install a community orchard there, and we've helped other neighborhoods install community orchards as well, which take a fair bit more work than shade trees, but also that's the benefit that the community wanted, to have access to fresh fruit. We are also doing partnering with the city of Asheville on their urban forestry work. So Asheville GreenWorks sits on the Urban Forestry Commission, and we have been working with the city to help develop tree ordinances and zero net loss canopy goals for the city resolutions. We just received funding from the North Carolina Forest Service to help the city set the foundation for an urban forest master planning process. So not coming up with the urban forest master plan, but doing community engagement. And we have on our staff, on a contract basis, a resident of Hillcrest, which is a public housing development, Daniel Suber, who's worked with us for a number of years, and he's doing community engagement in his neighborhood and will be helping facilitate those community conversations. Excited about. And also another thing we're doing is obtaining financial support for doing community forestry and engaging, making sure that racial equity is a part of that. So we have, we received a grant from the Gannett Foundation through a program called A Community Thrives to do tree planting, but also community engagement around urban forestry in areas that had been subjected to redlining. We also received a grant from Duke Energy to do racial equity work, as well as from D. Smith Reynolds. So it's become core to our work. We have dedicated staff time to our racial equity work for the first time this past year. Chelsea Rath is our community engagement coordinator, and she's been focusing in on that. So trying to put a lot more resources into this work because it's so important. It's so much more than just planting trees. But we do plant trees. That's a big part of what we do. And we plant in public spaces, public rights of way. And that includes places like Carrier Park, a few years ago, and South French Broad, thanks to community members who advocated for more trees on their street. We were able to get a bunch of trees planted on South French Broad, which is within the community that had been subjected to urban renewal. So that's what I have for today. I'd love to hear if you have any questions for me, or if any more questions came up for Dr. Carmichael.
I think we might have a hand raised, but I'm not sure if it's clapping or hand raised for Allie. I think it might just be her clapping. Clapping.
Yes, I think that was a.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
This is Kelly. I just wanted to say that this certainly makes me realize that it's a lot more than just planting trees and more complex, right?
Yeah, and I love trees. I love trees. I love people too.
Yeah.
And if folks want to get more involved, give us a call, give us an email, and we have a lot of work going on at our nursery out in Sand Hill, where we're growing trees to give away for free and also to plant throughout the city and the county. And we have workshops and work days. And we try to limit participation in our tree plantings in communities of color to residents. We don't like to bring in a huge group of outsiders from the, outside of the community to come into the community to plant trees. But we do encourage, some cross-community sharing as well. So there are those opportunities.
Well, I have a question. Oh, wait, you have another question. I'm gonna is it Tara? She has a question there, so I'll let her ask first, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, so Tara says, I'm wondering how you have handled situations where you know an area can really use some trees for wildlife and human benefits, and the local folks just really don't want trees. Would you try to encourage some trees be planted, or typically end up not planting trees in those areas?
That's a great question. Hi, Tara. Nice to see you here. And I will ask Dr. Carmichael to chime in as well. Before we make a decision about planting trees in a spot, we will start with the community and asking them, about their interest in having trees planted there. Well before we apply for a grant, ideally we're working with the community and not coming to them with a preformed proposal of like, we have these trees to plant, where do you want them? It starts with the question of, do you want them at all? And I say ideally because sometimes things just don't work out that way, or relationships change. We started talking to somebody and then they moved away, and other folks haven't had the same amount of interest in carrying on. So that's my long way of saying that we won't plant trees in areas where they're not wanted. That I think just leads to bad blood, bad relationships, distrust, and then worst case scenario is that there's this distrust and there's also trees that are being neglected and they become more of a hazard or an eyesore in the community. And then our relationships with communities begins to break down and people don't want to work with us anymore. So we just try to start with where people are and their interests.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'm taking a different angle as someone who's more doing the research, and I'm sort of an in-between person, viewing what's happening between the city and the nonprofit and the residents. And residents, I think it's important to note that all communities are heterogeneous, even if they have a shared history and shared experiences. Within any neighborhood, you can still have people who are wanting trees more so and pursuing that, and other people who are more like, no thank you, or I'm not interested, and some people who are kind of ambivalent and not really sure. And I think that it's important to respect all of those views and allow there to be some heterogeneity. So in one case, the Green of Detroit said, well, in order to make it financially efficient and effective, we try to only have planting events where we know we can plant a certain number of trees, because it's more cost effective for us if we can plant 30 to 50 trees rather than 5 in one place, because we're using the same amount of resources to execute that plan. So I think that it's helpful to try to, if it's possible, that you have some people who are like, yes, I want trees now, and they're more into that idea that at this moment, if you can prioritize, okay, let's work with you, and not have to force other people in the neighborhood who maybe aren't at that place or maybe don't want that for a lot of reasons. So, and I think it's also important in those early conversations to ask what benefits they want from trees and find co-benefits. So you might be really focused on wildlife habitat, and some people in the neighborhood might be as well. Other people might be actually more concerned about nuisance species and things like that, but they really want to have a program that can help build social cohesion more so, like a program that really emphasizes building relationships between the younger and the older generation of community. And this tree planting program can achieve all those things. And so it's more about finding out what it is that people want from a program if they do want it, and also just making sure that it's designed in a way with the community to think long-term about, so that it doesn't become a bad experience. So we're not just having conversations at the beginning about, what benefits you want and how to achieve that, but also what support is going to be needed and how can we actually achieve that to make sure that those benefits are actually realized and it's not just another promise unkept or something like that, or promise unfulfilled. So, because trees have a lot of stress in those areas. For urban environments are not the easiest for trees to grow in and to care for. So that's what I would say is, I wouldn't necessarily call it encouraging trees to be planted where people don't want the trees. I think it's more about not. This is a long answer, but so what I found is it's not usually that people don't want trees at all. It's that they don't want the burdens that they have seen happen with trees. They want to avoid negative outcomes because the benefits they have not experienced as much. They've mostly experienced more of the negative side. And so it's about how can we, because there's a lot of people in Detroit that I would have accepted a tree if there was a better maintenance plan or if there was more shared responsibility or discussion, and that's just not happening. So it's not that they didn't want trees. So but there are some people who just do not want a tree. But what I found in my research is that tends to be a smaller group of people. So I think it's more about finding out what are the barriers and under what conditions would somebody accept a tree and want a tree, and then trying to make that happen. Not necessarily getting someone to want a tree for the reasons you would value trees, if that makes sense.
One of the things that I took away from your presentation, Dr. Carmichael, was the idea that it's not about doing more education, like that people don't understand, what the benefits of the trees would be, that they just need to learn and get more information about that there's other things at play, like these barriers that you suggest. So, because oftentimes I feel like that is presented as a solution is like, okay, well, we just need to go out and do a campaign in this neighborhood to teach people about, the benefits of, it could be trees or it could be something else. So that they understand, and then they'll see it our way and we'll get the trees in there. So I really appreciate you bringing that to light during the presentation.
Yeah, the other thing I would mention too is that, it's a lot of times I see that there's maybe that is a common narrative of assuming that because people say no to trees, it's because they don't know trees are great or they don't know the benefits of trees. When really, if you look at like the history of disenfranchisement, it's actually been people have been excluded from decisions about whether they get trees or not and what their environment looks like. And actually, like, it's more like the issues around valuing trees is more of an issue for developers, to be honest, not so much residents, because the residents I've talked to, their biggest concern is the sustainability and making sure it's not an overburden on the residents and that it's not just like we plunk it down and leave. They're more concerned about sustainability. I would say more of the rash decisions regarding trees and viewing trees just as objects that don't provide all these benefits is more of a problem in the development field. Housing development and all of these things. I've heard many stories about documenting trees were planted by the Green of Detroit and then no one communicated with developers and developers didn't try to figure out who planted these trees. They just cut them all down and put a building in. And I'm not saying this is all developers, but it's certainly, I think it's just important not to pigeonhole that it's residents. A lot of times residents haven't had a choice in experiencing these dynamics. It's just been development, that has happened to them and around them. And that's affected the canopy more than residents not valuing trees, really.
Well, I bet it could be too, as if I'm an environmental organization coming in and talking about trees and how wonderful they are, that the residents might see that as valuing trees over valuing the residents themselves. And unintentionally, we begin to pit one against the other.
Yeah, no, I think that I love what you said earlier about if you haven't talked to somebody in the neighborhood, you shouldn't be planting trees there. Uh, yeah, that's really, to build trust, it's mostly focusing on what has been your experience in this neighborhood and what would help this experience be better with me and this organization coming in and following their lead really as much as possible. And humility is pretty important because the white supremacist kind of culture has been documented, and a big part of it is there's one right answer and white people in power know what that is, and that's really problematic. So because there isn't one right answer, and so the more that I think people who are from the background that is traditionally privileged white, and to acknowledge that and want to actually make decisions together, it goes a long way to changing that dynamic.
Yes, yeah. Humility is key. And even beyond environmental organizations, there's a lot of distrust with between communities and just nonprofit organizations. I've encountered the feeling that nonprofit organizations are actually exploiting the communities that they're seeking to serve, taking advantage, coming in with resources during a grant period and then picking up and leaving when that grant's over. So there's so much trust that needs to be built. And I think the first step towards that is being humble, coming in with an open mind of curiosity rather than answers.
Well, it's been fascinating to hear you guys exchange ideas and information. Is there anyone else who has any questions before we wrap up for the day? All right, it looks like that's all that we have. Thank you again so much, Dr. Carmichael and Dawn. This has really been such an informative discussion and something that's so important for everyone to hear. Like we said, they've both been recorded. We'll be sending out the slides with the links. And if you have any other questions or need any more information about what we talked about, you can email me, forestry@ashevillegreenworks.org, and I can put you in touch with Dawn or Dr. Carmichael if needed. And just thank you so much again, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.